Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a monumental, action-packed 50-year sprint that completely transformed the United States. I mean, we're talking about a country going from a quiet, agrarian society to an absolute global superpower. We're going to look closely at how rapid industrialization and global conflict totally reshaped the nation, setting the stage for the modern world we live in right now.
Just think about the scale of that shift for a second. An agrarian nation to a global superpower in only 50 years. To really understand our modern world, we absolutely have to look at this half-century of, well, intense whiplash. Because every single leap forward on the global stage, it triggered massive societal shifts right back at home. It's this incredibly fascinating story of profound national growing pains.
All right, so here's our agenda for the explainer. First, the industrial engine wakes. Then, progressivism and global reach. Third, WWI and the Roaring Twenties. Fourth, the Great Depression strikes. And finally, World War II transformation. We'll explore this rapid evolution through these 5 key eras, tracking the central tension between explosive national growth and its profound domestic consequences. So, here's the map of our 50-year sprint. We kick things off in the 1890s with a massive industrial shift, push into 1898 with overseas expansion, hit 1917 when the U.S. enters World War I, face that devastating economic crash in 1929, and finally arrive at the total mobilization of World War II. It's a rapid, breathless journey, so let's get right into it. Section 1. The industrial engine wakes, from farms to factories. We're starting our story right in the 1890s, when the U.S. underwent a massive, seismic shift from rural farming to urban manufacturing. The late 19th century brought explosive factory and railroad growth, not to mention the sudden rise of massive corporate trusts, and urbanization was just off the charts. This furious city building was driven by internal migrants leaving their family farms and international immigrants crossing oceans looking for new opportunities. You had unimaginable wealth concentrating right at the very top, while American communities were radically, permanently reshaped, most notably through the sudden emergence of crowded tenement housing. It was, without a doubt, an era of profound disruption and innovation. Naturally, all that disruption triggered some massive pushback. Rural farmers, who were being heavily squeezed by changing markets and rail freight rates, they formed populist movements demanding railroad regulation and monetary reform. Meanwhile, over in the cities, craft and industrial unions began staging powerful strikes. They were fighting for better wages, reasonable hours, and actual safe working conditions. Essentially, these two movements were the organized, powerful reaction from a working class trying to navigate a system that was changing way faster than they were. Moving on to Section 2, progressivism and global reach, expanding borders and reform. Because as industrialization created all this intense friction at home, the nation also began to flex its muscles internationally. All that domestic turmoil we just talked about? That gave rise to progressivism. Now keep in mind, this wasn't just one single idea. It was a highly diverse reform movement seeking to break the power of corrupt political machines, regulate those massive corporate monopolies, and drastically improve labor and health conditions. To manage the sheer chaos of rapid urbanization, you saw a wide coalition of middle-class reformers, labor activists, and women's organizations championing an era of democratic renewal. Basically, they wanted to make the government actually responsive to the everyday people navigating this wild new industrial world. But the story wasn't just domestic. The nation was simultaneously stepping out onto the world stage. This really kicked off with a victory in the Spanish-American War and the acquisition of new overseas territories. To protect those new assets, the U.S. built up a modern navy to secure vital trade routes. And that immediately led to expanding diplomatic and military actions across the Caribbean, the Pacific, and Latin America. As you might guess, this newly aggressive global reach sparked some fierce debates right back at home about the very nature of American imperialism. Section 3. WWI and the Roaring Twenties. Boom, bust, and conflict. That new global assertiveness was about to be fully tested when the United States entered World War I in 1917. Entering World War I required an absolutely unprecedented mobilization of industry and finance. It gave the federal government vast new authority over the economy. We also saw societal roles expand dramatically during this time, with women and African Americans stepping into public life and industry in vital, really unprecedented ways. But it's important to remember, the war also sparked heated debates over civil liberties and dissent. All of this ultimately exhausted the public, driving a really strong retreat back into isolationism in the decade that followed. And that post-war exhaustion led straight into the Roaring Twenties. Now, this was an era of deep, fascinating contradictions. On one hand, you had this massive economic boom, totally fueled by new consumer credit and the birth of mass culture, things like radio and cinema. It was the Jazz Age. But beneath all that glitter was some intense friction. We're talking conservative retrenchment, the strict enforcement of prohibition, the terrifying resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, and highly restrictive new immigration laws. It was a decade desperately trying to balance incredible consumer prosperity against bitter social conflicts over race, gender, religion, and national identity.
And then we hit the breaking point, because that economic expansion and consumer credit of the 1920s, it all rested on a very fragile foundation of financial speculation. That illusion completely shattered in 1929, plunging the nation straight into the 1930s, an era marked by unprecedented unemployment, massive bank failures, and severe social dislocation. Fortunes and everyday livelihoods were wiped out almost overnight. Talk about incredible societal whiplash.
Which brings us to a pretty terrifying question. How exactly does a nation survive a total economic collapse? Facing a crisis this deep, the old rules simply didn't apply anymore. The very relationship between American citizens and their federal government had to be fundamentally redefined if the country was going to make it through.
Section 4. The Great Depression strikes. The New Deal response. The answer to the catastrophic collapse of the 1930s came in the form of massive, unprecedented federal intervention.
That intervention, of course, was the New Deal. This was a sweeping, massive series of federal programs, agencies, and reforms aimed at providing three vital lifelines: relief, recovery, and reform. This initiative permanently expanded federal authority. It created lasting social welfare institutions designed to stabilize a broken economy and, crucially, to protect the nation's most vulnerable citizens.
They categorized these efforts into the famous 3 Rs. For immediate day-to-day survival, they offered relief through massive public works employment. To stabilize struggling sectors of the economy, they pushed recovery through agricultural supports. And to ensure a systemic collapse like this literally never happened again, they implemented long-term reforms, building robust safety nets like social insurance and strict banking safeguards.
However, and this is a really crucial point, this revolutionary expansion of federal power was not applied equally, not by a long shot. Implementation was highly uneven across different regions and populations. This sparked critical, ongoing debates about race, labor, and the true limits of federal action. Ultimately, it left deep structural inequalities totally unresolved for many minority populations and specific labor sectors.
Finally, Section 5, World War II transformation, the synthesis of a superpower. While the New Deal provided essential relief, it was ultimately a second global conflict that pulled the nation entirely out of the Depression and finalized its modern transformation.
World War II demanded absolute total mobilization. The economy shifted overnight. Industrial production accelerated on a scale the world had literally never seen before, effectively ending mass unemployment just like that. The whole effort was heavily managed via price controls, massive financing through war bonds, and incredibly tight government coordination with private industry. That industrial engine that first woke up back in the 1890s, well, now it was running at absolute maximum capacity.
But, true to form for this 50-year period, this total war brought immense contradictions. Wartime labor demands opened unprecedented new doors, expanding opportunities for women and African Americans in the workforce. Yet at the exact same time, the nation faced severe civil rights crises. The internment of Japanese Americans raised profound, deeply troubling constitutional questions regarding race, loyalty, and national security. It was this intense era of incredible economic empowerment for some and severe unconstitutional rights violations for others.
This stark dual reality birthed the Double V movement among African Americans, victory abroad and victory against racism at home. It was a powerful, undeniable demand. The core idea was simple but profound. The fight for democracy against overseas tyranny absolutely must apply to citizens fighting for basic civil rights within their own borders.
We're going to unpack exactly how a nation managed to balance this unprecedented global dominance with some of the most profound, deeply contested internal transformations in its entire history. From the end of the Second World War right up through the dawn of the 21st century, the U.S. saw rapid, earth-shattering shifts in just about every aspect of daily life. Because you really got to ask yourself, how on earth did the United States manage this insane tightrope walk? How do you shape the entire globe externally, while your own society at home is being completely restructured from the ground up? This wasn't just some slow, gradual evolution. It was a dynamic, turbulent time where huge foreign ambitions and really complicated domestic realities were just constantly pulling at each other. All right, let's jump into part 1, the global Cold War and containing the Soviet threat. Right after 45, the US found itself in a fierce new rivalry with the Soviet Union. And what's wild is how it played out on two totally different but completely connected fronts. Abroad, you've got foreign policy operating on this massive, unprecedented scale. The containment strategy, pouring economic aid through the Marshall Plan, building alliances like NATO. But at home, that global standoff reached right into American neighborhoods. Think about kids doing duck and cover drills in elementary school, intense federal loyalty investigations, and just this sweeping anti-communist paranoia. The Cold War wasn't just overseas, it was literally sitting in the living room. Moving right along to part 2, prosperity, suburban growth, and the post-war boom. While all that Cold War tension was simmering overseas, at home, the economy just exploded. It was like someone lit a match. We're talking innovative federal housing policies, massive new highway construction, and comprehensive GI benefits that fundamentally rewired American life. Suddenly, owning a home wasn't just for the wealthy. It was attainable for millions. And that completely redrew the map of the country, creating those iconic, booming suburbs like Levittown and completely shifting political power away from the inner cities and into these newly minted communities. But, and this is a huge but, who exactly was getting a slice of this American pie? Because the reality is, structural barriers in housing, education, and jobs meant this post-war boom was an incredibly unequal experience. Those shiny new, rapidly growing suburbs, they were largely redlined. They were closed off to African Americans and other marginalized groups, which exposed these deep, systemic, racial, and regional disparities right at the absolute height of American prosperity. Which naturally brings us to part 3, the movements for civil rights and the push for legal equality. You see, those stark inequalities we just talked about, they sparked some of the most monumental social movements in history. And to really grasp them, we have to start with the Great Migration. This was a massive, historic shift of African Americans leaving the rural South for northern and Midwestern cities. It intersected with wartime labor needs and those discriminatory housing policies I just mentioned. But most importantly, by completely transforming urban demographics, it laid the crucial, concentrated groundwork for future grassroots organizing. And you can literally trace a straight line from those demographic shifts in the 40s right to the landmark legal showdowns that followed. First up, you have the monumental Brown v. Board of Education decision in '54, striking down segregated schooling. That massive legal victory, combined with fierce, everyday nonviolent protests, eventually forced the hand of the federal government. All this momentum culminated in tectonic societal shifts, the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65, which systematically dismantled institutional segregation. Now, what's truly fascinating, and honestly a real game changer, is the domino effect this created. Securing legal equality for African Americans wasn't just one isolated victory. It served as a powerful blueprint. It was a catalyst. That fearless activism stimulated a much wider push for rights across all sorts of marginalized communities. It inspired the fight for women's rights, Latino and Asian American activism, and the early, crucial push for disability rights. That energy bleeds perfectly into part 4, decades of protest across the 1960s and 1970s. Because as we hit the 60s and 70s, that grassroots energy just erupts. It spread like wildfire. You've got all these different groups simultaneously standing up and demanding massive changes to the status quo. Women's liberation challenging traditional gender roles and workplace discrimination. Environmentalists emerging to fight unchecked industrial pollution. Student activists taking over campuses to demand free speech and university reform. Basically, established norms were under fire from every conceivable angle. And right in the middle of all this cultural upheaval is the anti-war movement, fueled by the Vietnam War. This conflict was an absolute stress test for the nation. It deeply, deeply divided the country and completely reshaped public opinion on military intervention. But perhaps its most enduring legacy? It forced a massive, critical reevaluation of government credibility, leaving deep legal and political consequences that forever changed how American citizens viewed the people in power. All right, let's pivot to part 5, a shifting late-century economy marked by global integration and restructuring. So, while the social fabric of the country is being completely rewoven, the economic foundation is literally shifting beneath everyone's feet. From the 70s through the 90s, the U.S. pivoted hard. It went from an economy driven by the heavy smokestacks of industrial manufacturing to one dominated by silicon chips and global shipping containers. Deindustrialization hit traditional areas hard, which is how we get the Rust Belt, while globalized finance and high-tech service sectors just exploded. The very definition of American work completely transformed. And along with that shiny, new, high-tech, globalized economy came some incredibly fierce domestic debates. People were arguing passionately over deregulation and exactly how much free-rein markets should have. At the exact same time, shifting demographic patterns and a totally new wave of immigration were reshaping the cultural landscape, which drove ongoing, intense struggles over social inclusion, the welfare state, and the continuous expansion of civil liberties. Which brings us to Part 6, the institutions guiding this change, law and civic life across the century. You really have to wonder, how did the nation navigate all this massive upheaval without just fracturing entirely? Well, it mostly comes down to core institutions. Throughout the century, the U.S. Constitution and the federal court system played absolutely decisive roles in balancing these intense conflicts, mostly by figuring out where state power ended and national power began. Meanwhile, electoral politics went through massive, seismic party realignments. And of course, we can't forget the explosive growth of mass media, which totally revolutionized how citizens engage with public life and how politicians actually reached voters. To actually make sense of these massive historical shifts, historians don't just look at a timeline of laws. They dig into diverse primary sources. We're talking oral histories from immigrant communities, New Deal program records, actual media artifacts from the protests. These provide the crucial evidence. They ground these sweeping national movements in real, personal, lived experiences. They remind us that history isn't just about dates, it's about the everyday people who lived through it. Finally, let's look at the big picture: continuities, transformations, and connecting the past to present debates. Because here's the thing, these incredible historical transformations we've been talking about, the complex immigration patterns, the ongoing struggles for civil rights, the fiercely contested foreign policy decisions, the constant tug-of-war over how big the government should be, they are absolutely not stuck in the past. They are the direct blueprints for the debates we are having right now. The arguments you see on the news today, they are absolute direct continuations of the movements we've just mapped out. Our source material actually sums this up perfectly, noting that understanding these developments requires attention to multiple perspectives. A true, full account of modern American history isn't just one monolithic story. It's woven together by the diverse voices and marginalized groups who had to fight tooth and nail for their place in the narrative. Understanding the modern United States means you absolutely have to listen to all of those different experiences. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought to ponder. How do these massive historical currents of migration, civil rights, and global policy continue to shape the specific, everyday debates happening in your own community right now? Because history is always in motion, and it's happening all around you. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep asking those tough questions.